Hello and welcome to Our Giant Leap podcast presented by the Space Generation Advisory Council. Our Giant Leap discusses diversity, equity, and inclusion issues within the global aerospace industry and try to have some fun along the way. My name is Patricia.
And my name is Jacqueline, and we're your hosts for today's podcast. The goal is to bring to light a person's career in aerospace and answer a specific topic. We will be coming up with tangible outcomes and solutions for the audience as takeaways from this podcast. So today, we'll be talking about how to enter the aerospace industry coming from a different domain.
This episode features an insightful interview with Yvonne Zielinski, an international arbitration lawyer and the founder of the Space Arbitration Association. We'll first be focusing on Yvonne's career and the association she founded, and then we will ask her for concrete steps and guidelines on how to enter the space industry coming from a different domain. Finally, we will discuss diversity in the space domain. Hello and welcome, Laura. It is our pleasure to have you as our guest on this podcast. Can you begin by introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here and to be talking about the association. So I'm German, and I grew up in Germany until I was 16. And then I moved to Paris, finished high school there, and then I started studying at Sciences Po. And when I finished, I did internships at Eversheds in Paris and at the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. And I decided to specialize in arbitration. After that, I did an LLM at Columbia in New York, and then I returned to Eversheds to work there as an associate in the arbitration and public international law team. I worked there for 2 years, and then my conventional career somehow took a turn because then I decided to quit to work on the Hillary Clinton campaign in the United States. And fortunately, we all know the outcome of this. And so after the election, I was a bit lost and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I tried to get a job in New York, but because of visa issues, it took some time. And I finally ended up in Mexico City, where I have been based since. So as I said, I'm German, which means that I really like to plan in advance. And I couldn't have planned any of this, but I think this is a good lesson that sometimes you just have to accept the direction life takes you at and make the best out of it. And I think a lot of the good things that happened to me during the last years wouldn't have happened if what I had planned had worked out. So yeah, this is where I am today.
Beautifully said. Whoa, there are a lot of interesting things that were mentioned. Unfortunately, I cannot ask you about all of them, but I will be focusing on the Space Arbitration Association. Can you tell us a bit more about that, maybe?
Yes, I founded the Space Arbitration Association in November last year. And if that's okay, I'll quickly tell you how I got this idea before telling you about the association as such. I'm specialized in public international law and international arbitration. And when I started working in Mexico City, I had the opportunity to work on a big satellite case by a French company against the government of Mexico. And so I had to quickly learn about satellites and international space law. And 2 years into the case, the pandemic started and I had much more free time than before because there were a lot of COVID cases in Mexico and we basically stayed locked in at home for months. So I started to read more about space law, attended webinars and took a class on strategic space law at McGill University online. And through these activities, I noticed that there's a space law community in which a lot of people know each other, which is a bit similar to what is happening in international arbitration. And I also noted that there was interest in the space community in dispute resolution, and that there were quite a few discussions about international arbitration in space. But I noticed that there was almost no interaction with the international arbitration community, as I know it. So this is when I had the idea to found the Space Arbitration Association to kind of create a community between the two, where people from like working in international arbitration and working in space could interact and maybe exchange ideas about dispute resolution in the space sector going forward. And with regard to the association as such, this year we have been and are still focusing on the organization of a conference series that will exist of 8 separate webinars. The ones that have already taken place are available on our website. And the website also contains a list of articles that have been written about dispute resolution in space in the last years. And we have just very recently also launched a blog where people who have ideas about dispute resolution in space are invited to publish their thoughts.
Amazing. So I can understand very well what you're talking about, since I'm also a lawyer and I also worked in arbitration. But maybe for our audience who are not very familiar with law, what made you want to specialize in space law?
Yes, as I mentioned, I have a background in public international law and have always been very interested in the intersection between law and politics. So when I was working in Paris, I had the opportunity to work on state-to-state cases involving the law of the sea. And when I moved to Mexico, I really missed this. So then I started working on the satellite case and discovered international space law. And there are quite a few parallels between space law and the law of the sea. And I was directly very fascinated by the existing treaties in space law, and especially by the potential for development, because I think there are a few areas in law where you can still build something like an outer space. And I think it is a great opportunity for our generation to have the chance to be part of that.
Amazing. And are there many lawyers that are specialized in this field?
That depends on what you compare it with. Because if you compare space law with, for example, family law, then obviously the number of space lawyers is very small. But there definitely are already space lawyers in many jurisdictions. Although I would say that most space lawyers currently focus on regulatory issues and not yet that much on dispute resolution.
Okay, so maybe also for the audience, maybe you can briefly explain to us what is international arbitration?
Yes, of course, that's a common question. International arbitration is a private form of justice that is based on party consent and autonomy. So we all know our domestic court system. So every country has courts and national judges. And arbitration is a form of justice outside of these domestic courts. It allows parties to a dispute to agree to refer their dispute to arbitration, usually before a dispute arises, for example, through an arbitration clause in a contract, but theoretically you could also decide to arbitrate a dispute once it has arisen. And the advantage is that when you decide to arbitrate a dispute, the parties can decide who the arbitrators will be, and they can also decide on the language of the proceedings, on the procedural calendar, and for example, on how much confidentiality will be applied to the proceedings. So those advantages are particularly relevant in international cases because, for example, if you have a French company and a Mexican company and they have a dispute, it's not very beneficial for either of them to either litigate in Mexican courts or in French courts in Spanish or French. So arbitration has the advantage that they can choose neutral arbitrators and, for example, to decide to litigate their dispute in English, so that there would not be an advantage for one of the parties, but there would be an equal setting for both. Another important characteristic of international arbitration is that arbitration awards are final and very easily enforceable internationally under a treaty called the New York Convention. So once you get an arbitration award, it's very easy to enforce it in other countries, which is not always the case for judgments.
That is very clear. Thank you. And how is arbitration applied to space litigation? Why does it have any advantages for space litigation?
Yes, so as I mentioned, arbitration in general is very well suited to resolve international disputes. And I think it has even more advantages for the space industry because, as I mentioned, it is based on party consent, and the parties to the dispute have the option of choosing their own arbitrators. And this has the advantage for parties to a space dispute that they have the opportunity to choose arbitrators who have experience and knowledge of the space industry. Because as I'm sure you're all very aware of, the space industry is highly technological, and disputes arising in space might not be always easy to understand for people who don't have experience in that industry. So if you go to a national court and you cannot choose the judge that will hear your dispute, it's very likely that the judge will be someone who might not have had previous exposure to the space industry, and so he might not be, or she might not be the best person to judge this particular dispute. So in arbitration, you have the advantage that you can choose your own arbitrator. And also, arbitration allows for enhanced confidentiality. Proceedings before national courts are usually public, whereas arbitration disputes can be completely confidential. So because there's a lot of technological know-how at play in space disputes, it is often advantageous to be able to keep the proceedings confidential. That's why I think arbitration is particularly well suited for space disputes, and it is actually a fact that a lot of space contracts already contain arbitration clauses, so they foresee that if there will be a dispute in the future, that dispute will be able to be arbitrated. And so the general expectation is that because of the increase in space activities, it is likely that there will be more space disputes in the coming years, and so it is very likely that there will be more space arbitration.
And how about space law? Is it already well established?
Space law is an important branch of public international law and also increasingly of domestic law. So there are 5 main international treaties that have been developed within the United Nations. The most important of these 5 is sometimes called the Magna Carta of Space Law. It is the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And there are also a number of soft law instruments directed, for example, at the mitigation of space debris. And finally, many more countries at the moment are enacting national space laws, and those are made to regulate and protect national space industry, but also to make sure that domestic space companies are complying with international space law, because under the international treaties, each country is responsible for the activities their own nationals or companies undertake in space.
Okay, and do you think that with the upcoming new space, there will be a need for more laws to be established and more lawyers to enforce them?
Definitely. I think more regulation is needed, and I would think that a logical consequence of this will be that there will also be a need for more lawyers, first to develop and enact more regulation, and then afterwards to enforce it. Because the new space economy is attracting more and more private actors to outer space, and the increase in space objects being launched is, for example, increasing the risk of collisions in space. A recent article published by the Space News newspaper said that there will be an increase by 7 times by 2030 of a collision in outer space. So one aspect that urgently needs more regulation is space traffic management, and there are a lot of efforts being directed currently at making space more secure, and obviously lawyers will have their part to play in this.
Good to know. Thank you, Laura.
So, space law is not included in the education of most lawyers. So, you must have had a special path into the space domain, like you said earlier. What would be your guidelines and advice to bring more professionals from other domains into space?
I think it is changing, and more universities are starting to include space law and even space arbitration in their programs. But yes, for those of us who are no longer students, there are actually quite a few opportunities to study space law and executive courses while you're already working. To provide a few examples, there's the Certificate in Strategic Space Law offered by McGill University once a year that I mentioned before. I have also just recently completed an online course on the new space economy that was offered by the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. And of course, there's the International Space University and probably many others that I'm not aware of. And I think for any lawyer interested in space, taking a few days to study space law at night or whenever you have time is a good idea, because it allows you to get an idea of what space law is about and whether you like it before you actually have to decide to transition your career into that directive. So I think those executive courses that don't take that much time are actually a really good resource to get a first idea of whether this is something you might want to specialize in or not.
Awesome. So what advice can you provide to someone coming from another domain that wants to enter space? Where do you start? What do you look for? What should we expect?
What is very interesting about space is that it touches upon many other sectors. So if we take insurance as an example, so if you are an insurance lawyer and you're interested in space, then you could, for example, focus on space and insurance by focusing either on insuring space objects or by taking advantage of satellite data for other areas of insurance. So this is just an example, but I think many professionals who are interested in space would have the possibility of finding an intersection between what they are already doing in space. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can take advantage of what you have already built and just add space to it. And so again, I would encourage anyone who has an interest in this to take advantage of the resources that are there to discover more about space and space law. I mean, for those of us who are lawyers, and to see if you can direct your career towards this.
Thank you. Did you face any obstacles when entering the space domain?
Space is very intimidating because it is very highly technical. And when you start hearing about space for the first time, there are a lot of terms you don't understand. At least that was my case. So at first, it seemed to me as if I would never be able to understand what space was about. And I remember that when I started working on the satellite case I mentioned earlier, one of the partners in our telecom practice had to spend hours trying to explain to me how frequencies work. Sorry for the noise. And how frequencies are distributed and organized. And in the beginning, it seemed really abstract to me. And the same happened to me again when I took the course on strategic space law at McGill, because I was listening to some of the classes and I found it really difficult to understand, especially, for example, classes on the military applications in space. But I really liked space, and so I took notes and I started reading about it, and I read one article or chapter on space law and the space industry almost every day for over a year. And after a while, I felt like I was understanding more and more of it. So I think it's like with a lot of things in life, the beginning is very hard, but if you're really interested and if you persist, it becomes easier over time.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to have a short break and listen to our teammate Laura, a different Laura, give us a fun fact.
Thank you. Are you familiar with May Jemison? She was the first African-American female astronaut. She always knew she wanted to be a scientist, even though science was not meant for women, as people used to think back then. She was also passionate about comics and science fiction. Indeed, Star Trek character Uhura, an African-American female lieutenant in the series, inspired her to follow a career in space. After persisting in the science field and facing sexist and racist remarks along the way, she obtained a degree in chemical engineering. She also studied medicine and went to Africa to work in a Peace Corps in Liberia and Sierra Leone as a medical volunteer. But she realized then that she still wanted to be a scientist. At the same time, NASA is recruiting and looking for diversity in the candidates' profiles. She applies and receives an answer a year later, saying that everything in her curriculum is really interesting. She then becomes the first African-American female astronaut in 1992. But she still likes Star Trek. One day, actor LeVar Burton, playing in Star Trek The Next Generation, realizes that he and May Jemison have a mutual friend who told him that she really likes the show and was inspired by the character Uhura. This is how May Jemison appeared as Lieutenant Palmer in an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation in 1993. She played the role of an officer serving aboard the USS Enterprise. Finally, after 6 years of scientific missions, She leaves NASA and teaches environmental science and global development issues. She still advocates for diversity within the STEM disciplines. I hope that fun fact made you smile, and I leave you with one of her inspiring quotes: "Never limit yourself because of others' limited imagination. Never limit others because of your own limited imagination."
And we're back. So now we're going to shift our interview's focus from space arbitration to the industry to the space domain itself. So, did you notice any lack of diversity in the space domain, whether it was clients, lawyers, experts, when you entered the domain?
Yes, so I haven't been in the space industry for a long time, but based on my experience so far, I have to say that I actually had the chance to encounter quite a few women working either at space companies or at universities focusing their research on space law. Professor Mabo and Professor Go are just two examples of space lawyers who have contributed a lot to the field and can really serve as role models for younger lawyers. But this being said, the law in general, but especially big law firms, are still very male-dominated, and I think this is also true for space law. So there definitely are women, but I think there are still many more men, and probably it will take time to change this.
So, in your experience, you've had opportunities to speak with these other experts, other women in the field. Did you get their opinion on whether or not the diversity has changed over time?
No, I've never discussed this with people in the space industry, but after this podcast, I definitely will. But based on my experience, also by how people reacted to, for example, me coming into the space domain with my idea of founding the Space Arbitration Association, I have to say my experience was quite positive. And I could single out, for example, Thorsten Koenig of Spacewatch Global in this context, because he, for those who are not familiar with his news outlet, he's focusing on the space industry. And when I presented my idea, he was really supportive, and his organization is hosting the events organized by the Space Arbitration Association. So I have to say, based on what I've seen, there's room for women, or probably even and minorities, although I couldn't speak to that personally, in the space industry.
Spectacular. Thank you. Glad to hear that. So when you were trying to enter the space domain, or your work in general, did you face any challenges as an outsider or a newcomer?
Yes, unfortunately, yes. And so when I started working, I thought that feminism should be a thing of the past, and that in the 21st century, being a woman would no longer make any difference. But unfortunately, the longer I worked, the more I noticed that there's still a long way to go to reach complete equality. I think there are no longer any hard barriers for women, but still many soft ones. And I can just give a few examples. In the Mexico City office of my American law firm where I work, for example, there's no woman with a partner, only men. So this is one thing that I think really jumps to when you look at it. And then another example is when we have to choose arbitrators in a case. And as a reminder for those in the audience who are not familiar with arbitration, so in arbitration, the parties can appoint their own arbitrators. And usually a lot of research and efforts go into finding the right candidate. So when we are working on selecting possible candidates, I usually try to include women. But for example, just the other day, I was on a call with another law firm who was co-counsel with us on a case. And we had to find an arbitrator for a very important case where a lot of money is at play. And I suggested a certain women candidate, and one of the male lawyers on the call said, no woman for this amount. And I was like, could you please explain what you meant by this? And he said, yes, then women lack experience to work on cases with these kind of amounts at play. And this is obviously not true. There are very experienced female practitioners and arbitrators, but I think it is a fact that there are very few women with that kind of experience. And I'm asking myself how there could ever be more if nobody gives them a chance, because it's a bit circular as an argument, because when you're selecting arbitrators, you would like someone who has experience in certain types of cases. But on the other hand, if you don't appoint women to work on these cases, then how will they get that experience? So I think there's still a lot of room for improvement. And I think another challenge that I've seen, and this applies equally to Paris and Mexico, because I don't want to give the impression that this is a Mexican problem, but another challenge can be the interactions, for example, in the corridors of the office or at office parties or outings, because I feel like a lot of jokes and conversations are tailored to men, and as a foreigner and as a woman, this can sometimes be uncomfortable. For example, if you hear colleagues discuss the physical appearance of another lawyer, like female lawyer, obviously you start asking yourself how they talk about you when you're not there. So I think this is one of the reasons why many women might feel uncomfortable and then tend to leave law firms to look for different settings. And I would encourage everyone to pay attention to this, to maybe change the general ambience in the offices so that this is no longer an issue.
That's a very good, if sad, point that you make. So what would be your advice to people who face these challenges?
My advice is to not let anyone intimidate you. Speak up, express your ideas, complain when it is necessary, even if this makes you less popular. Because I've seen that a lot of women don't say anything because they don't want to be like the one complaining, or they fear setback. But I think we are at a point where it's fine to say this if you notice something. And I also think that if you believe in something, go for it and just find your way, even if people criticize you while you're doing it. And to demonstrate this with my own example, when I started talking about my idea of founding the Space Arbitration Association, nobody took me seriously. I'm still relatively young, a woman, I'm based in Mexico, and to many people the idea seemed futuristic and not very promising. But I really believed in it, and I did it anyway. And I think that I have proven with the feedback I've gotten that it was a good idea. And I even think that sometimes what can at first appear to be a challenge can over time prove to be an asset. For example, I was very worried about doing this out of Mexico because I thought it might take away some of the credibility, because obviously the biggest part of the space industry is focused on Europe and the United States. There's not yet that much activity in space in Latin America, maybe except for Brazil. But I was based here, and so I thought I would try. And in the end, I think it actually benefited the association, because doing it out of Mexico rendered it maybe a bit more open and cosmopolitan, and people in other regions felt more connected to it. So I received a lot of interest, for example, from Asia and Brazil, and I'm not sure if that would have happened in the same way if I had been still based in Paris, for example. And speaking of Mexico in general, for example, when I moved to Mexico, a lot of people told me, like, what are you doing? You're ruining your career. You should come back to Paris. And I felt really happy in Mexico. And I thought, no, I will try to find a job here. And being happy where you are based is equally important to having like the best job you can possibly find. And in the end, I think the career development I had in Mexico was much better than anything I could have hoped for in Paris. So I think in conclusion, my advice would be listen to your instincts, do what makes you happy, and do not hesitate to pursue what you feel is right for you, no matter what others might think or tell you.
That's absolutely excellent advice, and we really appreciate you coming to talk with us today.
Yeah, Laura, I would like to add that I completely agree with you regarding your experience in law firms. I had the same. I agree. Sometimes there are certain comments and certain attitudes that can be a bit uncomfortable for women in these places, and I agree we should do something about it. And also, I had the same experience with the procedure of choosing arbitrators. It's true that the the question of should it be a man or a woman, it comes up, and it's true that there is a difficulty to choose a woman even when we try to, because as you said, there is not as much experience and as much diverse sectors. So it's true that the issue comes up that they maybe do not have enough experience. And we cannot keep doing this, because otherwise the women will never have the experience needed. So I agree completely with you and about this. And I agree we should start changing things, and also we should start speaking up in law firms. We should not be just quitting. We should be saying something about it for it to change, and not be scared of doing so. And I hope things will start changing soon. I also wanted to do a quick recap from what you just said. So for someone who is interested in the space domain in general, so as you said, whatever they have been doing before, they can always specialize in the space domain by just adding an expertise about space. So did you see that? Did you see while working in the space domain, people from other domains also entering the space domain, even if they did not know anything about it before? Did you see, for example, experts or people involved in the litigation?
Yes, I think a lot of people in the space sector have a background in a different area. I think one famous example is Stephen Freeland, who is a professor in Australia. He used to be an investment banker. But for anyone interested in these intersections, I would really recommend the course, the online course offered by the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne about the new space economy, because they have different chapters where they explain how different industry sectors relate to the space industry. So it gives you a really good overview over what's possible. And this course is directed at people who would like to found startups related to the space industry. So it's made in a way that gives you an idea of what possible intersections you could explore to have new ideas. So I found it very, very interesting.
Amazing. So to recap, you would say take online courses, document, read things, read articles, maybe watch online master classes. And would you say also networking? Is this something that has benefited you?
Yes, I think exchanging ideas with other people is always very enriching. So networking in order to gather information about the space industry and possibilities you could explore is one of the main things I would recommend people do.
Thank you, Laura. And so to conclude, for a lawyer who would like to specialize in space law who is interested in space law, so you confirm wherever you are in your career, whatever age, whatever you are doing as a lawyer, you can always specialize in space law if you are interested and if you educate yourself about it.
Yes, definitely. And I think, for example, many law firms already have space clients, but they might not be looking at it from a space perspective. So, for example, the insurance departments at law firms work with space companies and insurers insuring space objects. The transport department usually works with space companies, or at least in the United States, when there are space launches. I mean, it depends on the jurisdiction you are in. There might be more or less opportunities, but I think if you are already a lawyer working at a law firm, explore the opportunities you might already have where you're based. I think it's not so much about reinventing the wheel, but more about finding a link between what you're doing and the space industry.
Amazing. Also, Laura, I wanted to ask you, so for the Space Arbitration Association, so who can join? Is it only lawyers that are specialized in arbitration and want to specialize in the space domain, or it can be interesting also for anyone interested in space law or space in general?
I think it's interesting for anyone interested in space law. And I saw that, for example, at the conferences we organize, there are quite a few people working at space companies who are not lawyers who also connect. I think it's interesting for anyone who is thinking about possible space disputes and about how you can resolve them in the most efficient way. So you don't need to be an arbitration lawyer. You probably don't even need to be a lawyer at all. I think it's interesting for anyone who has an interest in these topics.
Amazing. Thank you, Laura, for your time and for sharing your amazing experience and thoughts on the subject. As a wrapping up question, can you maybe share with us a funny story from your work or studies?
Yes. When I was working at Eversheds, I was working with one of the most senior partners in the arbitration team, who was actually an expert on state-to-state cases and especially the law of the sea. So it was a great honor for me to be able to work with him. He took me to hearings in Hamburg and before the tribunal for the law of the sea. And I had two experiences with him where I felt very embarrassed afterwards. The first time was we were really working a lot during the hearing in Hamburg and didn't sleep much. And the last night, when the hearing was over, the night before we traveled back to Paris, I wanted to go out with another colleague, and he told me, like the senior lawyer told me, yes, you can go out, but our flight is really early and we can't miss the flight because I have a connecting flight to Singapore and I really need to be there on time. And I said, no, it's fine. I can wake up on time. I can do both. And I woke up the next morning with the phone ringing and someone from reception telling me, like, your colleague is in the lobby, the taxi is here, he's asking where you are, and I haven't even finished packing my suitcase. So that was my first experience with him, and he waited for me, and he wasn't very angry at me. He was just laughing about it. And then actually with the same lawyer a few weeks later, something else happened to me because I was organizing drinks for our team and I was still quite a junior lawyer. And I sent an email to everyone saying, like, I don't know, I can't remember the exact time, but let's meet at 6 at this bar. And he wasn't on that email list because he was very senior. But then I crossed him in the elevator and I told him about it, but I made a mistake in the time that I told him. I told him that we were meeting an hour earlier than I had sent in my email. So then at some point I noticed it and I rushed to the bar, and he was sitting like alone at the bar drinking whiskey. And he just told me, like, Laura, important people are never late, and didn't say anything else about it. But it really stuck with me because I found it quite impressive that someone who is very senior, whose time is very important, still manages not to get angry or to yell or to punish a younger lawyer for mistakes. But I think with that one phrase, he accomplished more than he would have if he had yelled at me. So now, since then, I'm always double checking my alarm and anytime I tell anyone. So yes, that's one story I can share.
Whoa, I can understand the embarrassment, especially like with lawyers. Like his reaction was a really nice one. But yeah, I can understand the difficulty, but I guess we all make mistakes like this. So it's good also to share them because like everyone can relate and everyone does this mistake, and it's not the end of the world. You can always bounce back from it, and it's okay. That's life. We're all humans, and you know, it's not the end of the world. So thank you, Laura, for sharing this with us. And indeed, during this podcast, we learned a lot about the challenges of entering the space domain coming from a different one. You can find the summary of this podcast on social media, where we'll be publishing the key takeaways from our discussion with Laura. You can interact directly with us on the Diversity and Gender Equality Project groups, social media, and leave feedback or advice from your side. Also, let us know who you would like us to interview next.
For more information and resources, please visit the Diversity and Gender Equality Project Group website as part of the Space Generation Advisory Council. Thanks again to our amazing guest, and feel free to check out the Space Arbitration Association. Thank you all for listening. We are your hosts, Patricia and Jacqueline, signing off.